So should I just, okay, I'll just start, colleagues. Lovely to be here. And let me share a few words with you before we kick off this great initiative today at this point in this longitudinal study. So I'm Preeti Sinha, I'm the Executive Secretary of the UN Capital Development Fund. UNCDF has been on the forefront of developing and piloting innovative approaches to financing local infrastructure and service delivery over the past decades. As far back as 1999, we published Taking Risks, a landmark publication that created UNCDF's reputation as an innovative and flexible financing agency. Taking Risks has a catchy title, and we at UNCDF still are taking risks in designing, testing, and piloting innovative financial instruments. However, what were the risks that we referred to in the 1999 publication? These risks are outlined by my predecessor, Paul Grossen, the then Executive Secretary of UNCDF. The local development funds were designed on the premise that capacity follows finance and investment, not the other way around. At that time, there was a reluctance to invest in local institutions and local economic development, partly due to an alleged lack of capacity. Through the local development fund approach that UNCDF turned that logic on its head. Together with partner governments, we piloted discretionary capital resources through fiscal transfer mechanisms directly into the local economy. The LDFs, as we call them, the local development funds, leveraged UNCDF's initial investment of millions to generate billions in sustainable and institutionalized flow of funds to the local level through national fiscal transfer systems and follow-on financing by the World Bank and others. These funds significantly contributed to fiscal decentralization and the expansion of local fiscal space and local fixed capital formation, two prerequisites for economic transformation. I'm delighted that Leonardo Romeo, a former UNCDF staff member and one of the pioneers of this approach, is on the panel here today. Hello, Leonardo. Leonardo is now the NYU Adjunct Professor of International Development Planning, President of Local Development International, LDI. I'd like to continue. The results were often a surprise to partner governments. Local government institutions were revitalized as the resources gave them meaning and purpose. This reawakening led to increase in capacity to manage these resources. The private sector grew as local contractors tendered to provide infrastructure, goods, and services. Local professional services, for example, legal and accounting services, found increased demand. Countries such as Mozambique, Nepal, Uganda, Cambodia, and Vietnam were emerging from difficult periods at this time. And whilst the capital cities were growing, this increased economic activity was not finding its way to smaller towns and rural areas. The risk taken by UNCDF changed this dynamic, as documented in several case studies, including the 2007 World Bank publication called Aid That Works, Successful Development in Fragile States. Once governments saw the impact of local development funds on local economies and local governments, they wished to expand the pilot experiences nationwide. UNCDF developed a partnership with the World Bank to leverage its initial seed capital and model financing mechanism into billions of dollars that were directly channeled to the local level through IDA and ministries of finance. We are delighted to have Roland White here with us, Global Lead for City Management, Finance and Governance at the World Bank, on the panel today. Thank you, Roland, for all your help and support and partnership. Roland has personal experience of this process in several countries. Governments then proceeded to incorporate these local development funds into their own fiscal systems after the World Bank scale-up period was concluded. In this way, UNCDF and the World Bank were able to apply their comparative advantages to drive local development in many of the world's least developed countries. It's a privilege to welcome our friends and colleagues, Paul Kasul Mukasa, here, Senior Specialist, Ministry of Local Government of Uganda. Welcome, Paul. And Ganga Datta Ashwati, former Secretary, Ministry of Local Development of Nepal. Welcome, Ganga, to the panel. Both have direct experience of the local development funds in their respective countries, and we're so pleased and delighted that they're here with us today. So we did not rest here. Local capacity is important, and local investment requires targeting to become effective. While retaining the principle of local autonomy, UNCDF refined the system of performance-based grants to provide incentives for improved performance and impact. This led to a second generation of collaboration with the World Bank and inspired many similar initiatives, including in urban areas and with other development partners. Jesper Stephenson, a long-standing partner to UNCDF in this work, is present here, and we warmly welcome him to the panel. Hi, Jesper. Performance-based grants are also meant that it was possible to address specific urgent investment priorities. Climate change adaptation evidently requires localized responses, and that depends on the characteristics of the area. Therefore, UNCDF further modified this approach into Local Climate Adaptive Living Facility, or LOCAL as we fondly call it, as an LDC mechanism, which is the least developed country mechanism, now reaching 27 countries. And we are so proud of this work, and we do hope that it has very direct impact on the ground, and we continue to grow this part of our work. In their 2007 book, Development Success, Statecraft and the South, authors William McCourt and John Bebbington from the World Bank argue that a 10-year period is required before credibly measuring success. A development finance initiative needs to complete more than one project cycle, prove a sustainable business model, demonstrate scale up, and survive at least one change in government. Since Taking Risk was published in 1999, we are proud to be able to test ourselves against the McCourt and Bebbington criteria. In response to the need for credible longitudinal studies that account for the sustainable leverage and impact of development finance, UNCDF, in partnership with Dege Consult APS, conducted the study presented today as a first attempt to provide a comprehensive long-term analysis and understanding of the financial leverage and development impact of the UNCDF-supported LDFs, the local development funds. This type of analysis does not make it into shorter-term project evaluations and annual reports. Therefore, I'm privileged and proud to have the opportunity to open this meeting today, which will be chaired by my colleague, Christelle, the Africa team leader for our local transformative finance practice. Christelle has managed and contributed substantially to the local development funds over the many years. My colleague David as well, David Jackson, Director of Local Transformative Finance, has been instrumental in leading UNCDF's contributions in this area and will provide some reflections to close the conversation, including on the next steps for UNCDF on this exciting journey, along with all of you. So thank you so much for patiently listening to my words, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion. Thank you. Over to you.
Christelle?
Okay, thank you. I thought you were waiting only for the panel, but thank you, Preti. I mean, for those very powerful and insightful words, and encouraging as well. So now we give the floor to Jesper Stephenson. He's going to explain what he has done in this study and what has documented in terms of results and leverage. Over to you, Jesper, and I guess you have a presentation, right?
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for this great opportunity to share some of the findings from a study we did over a longer period of time of the piloting of local development funds in 10 countries and how the development funds have developed into financial mechanism in the various countries. I will only pick a few of the findings because the time is short, but I recommend that you look at the book with more findings. But thank you very much for giving me the opportunity for the highlighting of some of the findings. I will go through a short outline, the objective of the assignments, the concept of local development funds. I think most of you are aware of it, but just to recap, a few words about the methodology, and then of course focusing on the results and some concluding comments. First of all, the objective of the assignment was to look at whether the UNCDF pilots programs have had any impacts on the modalities and the size of the intergovernmental fiscal transfers in the 10 countries, both in terms of scaling up, but also the actual qualitative aspects, the modalities for the transfer systems. So we worked in 3 phases. We first agreed on the concept, then we had a testing of that in 2 countries, Uganda and Tanzania. And then we rolled it out also here to another 8 countries. It was a test-based study, but we had involvement of people who have been involved in the actual pilot and rollout, and also interviews with the various case teams in different countries, the World Bank, UNCDF, UNDP, and others. And we are looking at the results from the start of the pilot to the end in 2017. So it's for some countries might be 17 years, other places might only be 10 years, but it will stand the test which was mentioned in the introduction. The main objectives of the local development funds in most countries is to provide discretionary capital investment funds, but also to strengthen the capacity of the local government to handle these funds. So it is typically encompassing 3 elements: the development funds, which are multi-sectoral, on-budget, formula-based, to fulfill the local government mandates, and then also linked very closely to capacity building support, and in most countries also on a policy leverage. And it could be a reform of the fiscal transfer systems or wider local government reforms. But I think the most important is that local development fund is not only about finance, it's also about capacity building, it's also about reform and system buildings. The concept is that funds will be routed through the local government systems, the central and local government budgets, using the local government public finance and management systems. It is multi-sectoral, not earmarked, and that's very important to emphasize. It's also focusing on development budget, capital investments and service delivery. It is also, as mentioned, typically developing clear allocation criteria, formula-based allocation. This is very different from the previous systems, which were arbitrary allocation of funds, but this is based on a clear allocation formula, a clear amount of funding for local governments, and then very closely related to capacity building support. Since 2000, it has been often linked to performance-based grant allocation, to performance-based grants, which was also introduced as part of the LDF arrangement. And it has also introduced a number of new practices in intergovernmental fiscal transfers. And then, as mentioned, combined with policy support in some countries. We looked in the study very closely on because these LDFs can vary a bit across the countries. So we looked at what were the types of grants, the size of this pilot, and the elements of performance-based allocations, the links between grants and capacity building, but also how the pilot was linked to the overall intergovernmental fiscal transfer system and to the other modalities in the grant system. We looked at the timing of the LDF reform compared to the rollout, which is very important. And as I said, the end was 2017, but we can also discuss hopefully what happened after 2017, because in some of the countries there have been further upscaling of the LDF modalities. We then looked at the impact of the pilot on the existing grants to local governments, the size and numbers. In terms of rollout of local governments, often these pilots started in the few local governments and were then rolled out to the whole country over time. But I think equally important is the qualitative impact in terms of changing the system for allocating funds to be more according to the PIFA assessment criteria, more transparent, more formula-based, and then also performance-based, as mentioned, and then how it was linked to the capacity building support. In different countries, there were different phases of this rollout. It happened some places very quickly. In other places, it was done through a number of phases. Of course, I know there will be discussion of the issue of attribution. So we really were very careful looking at the timing of these reforms, what happened immediately after the pilot, and also whether there were any evidence in program documents that the scaling up has learned from the pilot And in most countries, it was actually mentioned directly in the rollout documents that this was based on experiences from the pilots. And in other places, it was very clear from how the modalities were spelled out. We also interviewed stakeholders and people who knew about the system in the different places. And of course, then looked at what would have happened if there was no pilot, what would have happened, what was the situation before and after, and so on. But in the book, you will find different references to this, but we can come perhaps back to that. In terms of the results, I think the most significant is the expansion in the fiscal space for local governments. These pilots were relatively small, typically less than $10 million, but in some of the countries, they have rapidly increased through the upscaling from, first of all, other development partners, but then in the later stage from the government itself in the various places. So if you look at the total amount of funding in the actual pilot, in the initial pilot, it was in all the 10 countries only about $56 million US. But in the period up to 2017, our findings show that about $3.5 billion have used the same modalities based on the pilot initiatives and the experiences learned. In some countries like Uganda, Tanzania, and Bangladesh, of course, larger countries and larger programs, it has expanded tremendously. And in other places, there was a more modest scaling up. But there was also in all the countries elements of qualitative improvement in the intergovernmental fiscal transfers based on the lessons learned from the pilot, particularly on the allocation formula, moving from arbitrary allocation to more predictable, more based on needs-based criteria for allocation of grants. And also it was often combined with a much more performance-based allocation, which was giving local governments incentives to improve their performance. And then also it was a testing of direct flow of funds. Previously, most funds from development partners came indirectly from development partners, bypassing the government system. But here they used the government system and tested out that. And it was actually used after the pilot. And then I will not have time to go into all the other impacts in terms of capacity building modalities, but I think one of them is very important. That is the move towards a more demand-driven capacity building system with capacity building grants, whereby local governments are more in the driving seat to decide what they need to respond to their weaknesses. One of the examples in Uganda was the DDP program. It was the first of these LDF, but there were other more or less at the same time in Palestine and in other countries. But in Uganda, it encompassed all the elements in terms of the formula-based allocation, multi-sectoral grants, performance-based with good incentives, annual performance assessment of local governments. And also it introduced the demand-driven capacity building grant, which you will see in many countries around the world now. And instead of having just training and centrally driven capacity building, you gave the local governments their own funding and then with some guidance, help them to strengthen their own capacity building. It also tested the links between development grants, annual performance assessment and capacity building support. And it used the government systems. Money was flowing in the beginning through the Ministry of Local Governments to the local governments, and in the second phase through the Ministry of Finance, through the Treasury system. And this is still the situation today. You will see the upscaling in Uganda from the original pilot of 5 local governments back in 98, 99, and then a gradual upscaling first with the World Bank and then the Dutch funding, and then other development partners joined. And then government of Uganda took over the funding for some years. World Bank then came back and designed an urban window of that, and that is still scaled up over time. And what has happened after 2017 is actually a further upscale from the funded by the government of Uganda through the grant system, and also with the World Bank urban window, which has continued and expanded since 2017. So just in rough figures, the small initial pilot of around 13 million has expanded, as I said, to around 700 million in that period. And you see here the distribution across the years and the funding partners. You will also see over the period of time that the small contribution from the DDP was, if you look at the figures, around 2%. But around 50-50 then came from the World Bank and other development partners and the government. And we see that in many other countries that the government has actually contributed significantly to the upscale of the local development funds. In terms of attribution, it has had a strong impact on the future development grant system. If you look at the transfer reforms in the country, it happened directly after the pilot, and it was actually planned for in the pilot already. The teams have already talked together and planned for it, but of course they wanted to see that it was actually working well, and then it was very quickly upscaled. It was also mentioned in program documents from the World Bank in the appraisal report that the experience from this pilot worked well, and the modalities should be, of course, refined, but basically applied. It was also mentioned in the government's fiscal decentralization strategy already in 2001 that this should be the main modality for the development grants to local governments, and in other studies as well. And as I said up today, the LDF modalities is still applied and have, of course, been refined and improved on, but the basic principles of performance-based multi-sectoral grants with the development capacity building support as well is still ongoing and has been upscaled. So the impact was on the qualitative aspects in terms of formula-based development grants, performance-based system, which has been quite effective, and also allocating funding to the lower levels of local government for the first time with discretionary capital grants. Also for the first time, there was the demand-driven capacity building support, and the LDF managed to harmonize all the development partner support. Before the pilot, there were so many different small area-based programs, but now they were harmonized and used the same transfer procedures. And that has reduced the transaction cost for local government, improved efficiency. In other countries, we see the same trend. In Bangladesh, there was also a significant scaling up in terms of the funding, but also rollout in terms of the local government. It was rolled out to all the 4,000 local governments and with around 140 million per year in the end years. But basically the impact was the same on the allocation formula in terms of performance-based grants. Participatory planning was improved, and many other qualitative aspects of the performance of local governments were improved through this performance-based grant allocation. So the overall conclusion is that these small innovative pilots, if they are well designed, and I think this was one of the major pilots in intergovernmental fiscal transfer over the last 2 decades, can work if and can establish a long-lasting mechanism for enhancing funding for local governments. It's very different from projects. It has established a mechanism for transferring, and it has improved the fiscal space for capital investments for local government, improved the trust in local governments, and it has also improved participatory planning and decision-making at the local government level. A more formula-based and predictable grant system has occurred and provided strong incentives for local government to improve their performance. The capacity building modalities have completely changed through these pilots in all the countries we have looked at, and the local governments are more in there and have more ownership and are more in the driver's seat in terms of the capacity building support. And then harmonizing of development partner support is also important to mention. But it has great opportunities also to be expanded now in the future in terms of climate change funding in other areas as well. And it was mentioned in the introduction that, for example, one of these initiatives under LOCAL is to try to use the performance-based grants for climate change funding. And they are very encouraging pilots going on in that area as well. Of course, there have also been challenges when you upscale. First of all, you need to continue to improve and refine the models. In all the countries, we have seen second generation, third generations, you need to continue to adjust. Also, there has been some few challenges when you mainstream upscale with government funding, but some countries have good experiences from that, Solomon Island, Uganda, and Bangladesh, but others have been a little bit more difficult in terms of getting government funding behind the system. It's very important that there is a clear institutional framework, division of task and coordination is very important. We also saw that with the COVID challenges, that this is one of the most important factors behind the efficiency of systems. And then, of course, when you upscale and you do assessments and performance assessment of many local governments, you need to ensure credible and neutral performance assessment when you upscale, and it's not always easy. And we also see that there are still multiple funding going to local governments, not always coordinated. So it's a challenge to continue to harmonize and ensure that we are working on one intergovernmental fiscal transfer system. The fragmentation is still there in some of the countries we have observed. But generally, the main conclusion is that the small pilots have had a tremendous impact in all the countries over a much longer time span than we would have expected. And they have impacted in all the places, of course, some places more than others. Yeah, thank you very much. That was, I think, what I could manage within 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Jesper. And that was 15 very substantial minutes. I mean, it was really, really interesting and important being able to gather what's happening in those 10 countries for the last 20 years. So thank you very much. So, I mean, in terms of the journey of this workshop, we heard what Betty said in terms of what is UNCDF DNA in terms of taking risk and how we try to take risk from the ground, so with our foot on the ground, by putting in place those systems and those mechanisms with performance-based grant, supporting municipalities and local government. So now we are going to have 4 panelists that have already been introduced. So thank you very much, Ganga, Paul, Roland, and Leonardo for being here. We have 2 panelists coming from countries, from Uganda and from Nepal, and then Roland is going to give the perspective of one development partner, the World Bank, and Leonardo, as one of the father of the local development fund, is also going to give his own perspective in terms of what it means for local development in the world. So I will give further floor to Mr. Awashi Ganga to give us your insight about how you have been experiencing this local development fund and what are the lessons learned. Nepal is, as well as Uganda, one of the very, very rich countries in terms of history of decentralization. So over to you, Ganga.
Thank you, Krishna.
For 5 minutes.
Highly regarded Priti Shinaji and David Jacksonji, and my highly regarded friend Jesperji. Thank you for UNCDF family for inviting me in this very important meeting. I was one of the implementers of the LDF program since the very beginning, 2001 to 2008. Up to the handover to the LGCDP program, which was a national program newly built. And most of the piloted activities were rolled out through the LGCDP program, local governance and community development program, which was the national program designed all the development partners and government work together. And most of the findings of the LDF was rolled out on that. So that was the background. This 2001, Nepal was in the peak of the conflict, the highly conflict zone. And after 2002, unfortunately, elected representatives were not in present. So LDF, even the LDF was practiced through the existing systems and procedures, and rolled out firstly in 8 districts up to 2003, then expanded to the 20 districts with the support of the DFID, now FCDO. So it has brought the local horizontal transfer of money to the 5 million because of the 2001 to 2003, we were very successful to implement the program. So this 10 million projects, the ultimate objective was to elevate poverty in the remote areas of the hills of Nepal, especially remote VDCs, villages, and communities. So the maximum utmost importance was given to transfer money to the disadvantaged groups, especially women and deprived communities. So 20% more fund secured for those communities. That was one of the it was the users committees were formed because the local leaders were not there. So community governance was highly, we used a vehicle to the community governance. So it has minimized the conflict because the community mobilization was most important to minimize the conflict. And it has checked the migration, seasonal migration also, because the local employment created at the local level. At the end, we have completed about 3,000 basic public and community infrastructures. So this was the very big achievement on the one side to create employment, and one of the important thing is that we use the local systems and procedures, not having the any donor driven ideas in this aspect. So whatever the systems were given in the local self governance act and other rules, associated rules and guidelines, that system was maximum utilized, piloted in the 8 districts and then rolled out to the 20 districts. And in the meantime, UNCDF, with the support of the technical assistance, YESPER has played very key important role to change the whole this formula-based, to pilot the formula-based funding, firstly at the DFDP funding. And then gradually it was rolled out to the government block grants also. So nationwide, this pilot of the block grant fund flow on the basis of the formula basis, that certain criteria were given, weightage were given, like the population, poverty, geographical trend, and women poverty, or all these aspects, and accessibility cost index were used in a weightage way. That formula, the ESPER has played very supported us to design these formulas, and the local body fiscal commission has taken this ownership at that time. And so this formula was at the beginning, because the during even that period, the block grant was increased tremendously from 300,000 to the 1.5 million minimum. And this performance-based grant allocation system was also later initiated. So to design this formula, if performance-based fund is introduced, then 1.5 million was secured minimum, and 3 million, up to 3 million, the best performer can receive, who secured the more than 80% of the marks in the performance measures. So that was the one of the change, so it has doubled their block grants. So the communities were encouraged to systematize their systems and procedures through the MCPM system, which is the minimum conditions and performance measure system. It was rolled out nationally with the initiation of the local bodies fiscal commission, and to the nationwide using the block grant and other DP partnership fund also. So that way it has bring the tremendous. Now in the change situation also,
Ganga, we will
now
get
we are restructured in the federalism.
Ganga, sorry to cut you. Can you hear me?
Pardon?
Can you hear me? Sorry, Ganga. Sorry to cut you. We need to have your final words. I mean, sorry, but we have other panelists. That's very interesting.
Okay, now it is also relevant what we are practicing in the federal system also. Nepal is in now federal system. Now Natural Resource and Fiscal Commission, the National Natural Resource Fiscal Commission has used this funding modalities, like the criteria based funding modalities. Now MCPM system can be rolled out if we can mobilize the small TA to the NNRFC, and that is the possibility. So thank you very much. Within the limited time,
thank you, Ganga.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Sorry to cut you, because that was really interesting, and thank you for raising this issue of local employment. I mean, the ownership and the need to use the national procedure. So without further, give the floor now to Paul to give in Uganda and how the local development fund experience was driven there. Paul, are you here?
Yes, thank you very much,
Yes.
Christian. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Thank you very much, UNCDF, for inviting me to participate in this important discussion. From Uganda, I've been working on
And again,
LD stuff since probably 1996 when we launched the very first pilot, the DDP pilot, which Jesper talked about. And I just want to add a few things to what Jesper said. Apart from the fund itself, I think we've learned so many other things. The first thing is that, maybe just to say something about the fund itself. The fund itself, I think, churned out a lot of small and large projects in local governments, which we had never experienced before. I think at the height of the work we were doing with the World Bank later in the years, we were churning out between 8,000 to 12,000 projects, small projects a year. And these are projects ranging from spring protection, supplying school desks, going all the way to community access roads and health centers, very large ones, and even bridges, very big bridges across district roads. So we had a very big variety of projects which local governments had never experienced before. The other thing is that a lot of capacity was built. Somehow with the national assessment process, the performance assessment exercise, it tends to set targets, to help local governments set targets and measure what they are doing. And actually, we realized a lot of change in the quality of work, or quality of outputs, and in the quality of the work itself. The projects themselves improved tremendously. The other thing is that we realized that local governments now understood the laws and regulations much better than before. Again, because of the performance assessment exercise, you find that local governments now were more realigned to working along and complying with the laws and regulations that are issued by government. So we think that in that regard alone, local governments learned a great deal. Then we also saw a lot of improvement in legislation. This was not intended, but the LDF mechanism led to a refinement of a lot of legislation here in Uganda. A case in point, we had changes in the planning and budgeting regulations for local governments, the property rates regulations, the Public Finance and Management Act, the local council codes, and the procurement process, and generally the privatization process. It changed tremendously as a result of what we're getting as a result of the experiences we're getting from the LDF program in Uganda. In addition, it gave the Ministry of Local Government and other sector ministries better direction on how to inspect and support local governments. I saw that very specifically within the Ministry of Local Government, that a lot of change happened in the way inspection, support, supervision, monitoring was being done by the ministry as a result of the LDF. Jesper talked about improved public participation and ownership. This might sound small, but to us it was one of probably the biggest achievements we realized. The public participation right from the grassroots all the way up to national level was tremendous. Then we also realized some cost reduction from the projects that were being implemented by central government. The ones implemented by local governments, actually, we could realize there was a reduction in the costs, something which we probably did not imagine would happen, but actually it turned out that it was cheaper contracting out some of the work by to the local governments themselves. Finally, I wanted to mention that the LGF also influenced the structures of local governments. Which positions should we have at local government level? It became more and more clear as to what kind of positions we need to emphasize at local level in order to get work going. And so a lot of restructuring, I think the restructuring has been done about 3 times since we started the LDF programs in Uganda. And that alone has changed the fabric, the texture, and the structures of local governments. And we are able to see much better results now. Thank you very much. I'll end here. All the best.
Thank you so much, Paul. What a great testimony about what's happened in Uganda and the role of the LDF in the journey of decentralization there. And as you said, I mean, this is always a work in progress, and things have to change depending on the context and the needs. But yeah, this cost reduction and the way the LDF has been able to document the changes in the national system are very important and great explanation about what's happening in Uganda. So thank you. Now, Roland, are you here? So we will have the perspective from a development partner, the World Bank. So Roland, the floor is yours. And again, I mean, 5 minutes. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Christelle, thanks, and good day to everybody. Look, let me just confine myself, I think, to 4 basic observations. The first, I think, is just to note that, you know, the type of intervention that is the subject of the study, you know, what is called the local development funds, we at the bank here refer to as our urban performance grants. And we have a very substantial portfolio of such instruments now. So basically, if you look at our entire urban portfolio, the urban performance grants now account for over 40% of that portfolio in terms of dollar amounts since 2013. So just putting aside all of the what we call the first generation of these between the years of about 2013, we've invested over 5 billion in urban performance grants. And I think our current portfolio involves operations where in around about 15, 16 countries. All right? So it's a very substantial aspect of what we do. And they vary in nature between the sort of focus in the Uganda case that you've heard about most recently, around about, I think, 16 urban local government secondary cities, to the case of West Bengal in India, where we are basically funding together with the government, which provides a very substantial portion of the funding for these. We're funding 3,300 rural gram panchayats. Those are small rural local governments throughout the entire state. The second point I wanted to make is that the reason that we do this is because of the potential enormous long-term development impact that we as an institution can have through investing in this type of modality. You know, the way we like to put this very simply is that it is as or even more important for us as a development institution, not simply to leave behind pipes in the ground, but to leave behind the institutional systems which are capable of planning and executing projects to put pipes in the ground, then maintaining those pipes in the ground and expanding those networks over time. You know, as the World Bank and as frankly the international sort of, you know, development or donor community relative to need, we only have a small amount of funds to provide, you know, all of us together. If you look at what the total need urban, rural, local governments are, we can only ever provide a small fraction of that. And in a way, the most efficient and effective thing that we can do is to really focus on the systems which are responsible in the long term for taking all the resources that can be available from all potential sources, public, private, international, development community, domestic, etc., and strengthening those systems so that we leave behind a sustainable system. And urban performance grants, I think, provide us, in the way that Jesper has described in his presentation, with the capability of doing that, because of the way in which they mix a certain amount of capital funding and the way they design the intervention around the capital funding to provide the incentives and the capacities to lead or to underpin the long-term development of the institutional systems. The third observation I want to make is that, you know, it is possible to have very significant impacts in this way without necessarily major policy changes, which can be politically difficult and perhaps not possible at any point in time, because of the way in which you change the way in which the money moves. All right. So, you know, whereas overall, you know, if you look at sort of the policy development at the policy level around decentralization and local autonomy, it's often politically driven. It's politically inflected in the sense that it may come, it may go, policy change may be slow. If you get on with the job of just shifting the way in which the money moves so that you can ultimately build these local capacities and then provide the resources through those, so that those local capacities can then take the financial resources, not just from the World Bank side or UNCDF side, but from the government's own resources, for example, and program those into development impact on the ground, you can have very significant impacts on your intergovernment fiscal and institutional system without even necessarily addressing frontally, as I say, major policy changes, which can be difficult or can be slow. And then the last observation I want to make is just to reflect on the fact that I think the partnership with UNCDF in a number of countries, you know, has been, as Jesper has mentioned, I think a very successful one. You know, it's you know, by no means the case that all of our urban performance grants, you know, our entire investment portfolio has been the result of a partnership with UNCDF. You know, we've often just you know, began and sort of intervened directly together with our counterparts and built these systems in countries. But in a number of countries, Uganda is one, Nepal is another, etc., the partnership with UNCDF has actually been absolutely critical. And I think this overall sort of modality where, you know, UNCDF has gone out, almost experimented a bit, piloted, created the beginnings of a system which we, as, you know, an institution, obviously with access to greater funding volumes, can get behind. We also, I think, have significant convening power. So we've been able to bring together, together with UNCDF, a range of other donors. And as a result, I think, build a set of systems where, as they say, the whole is much more than the sum of the parts. And so there have been a number of countries in which I think this modality has been absolutely critical. And I think that needs to be, I think, you know, held very carefully in mind in thinking about the future development of this kind of portfolio and activities of this kind at a global scale going forward. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Roland, and we are looking forward to continue to build this partnership. Thank you so much. So let's move quickly to Leonardo video, so we can have, because we are at the end of the meeting, we still have 10 minutes left, so we need to move fast. Leonardo, or someone can run the Leonardo video, please. Okay, let's go. Thanks.
Good afternoon, and glad to be able to participate in this discussion of what I consider a very valuable study. Actually, a study with a double value. First of all, of course, it does well what it sets out to do, which is to document the pioneering role of UNCDF and the impact that the LDF mechanism might have had on the reform of intergovernmental fiscal transfer systems in several countries. But also by providing that documentary evidence, the report helps fight memory loss and opens the way for a deeper reflection on the rationale and the future of the LDF mechanism. So I would like to make a couple of comments on both aspects, on both values. On the first value, the report might have been further strengthened by the inclusion of the Cambodia case, for example, because in Cambodia it was really a truly pioneering work. The LDF was set up when local authorities were not even there, so the resources were accruing to self-governing commune development committees, which had been set up as forerunners of the local authorities, which were eventually elected in 2002. At which point the LDF was turned into the Commune Sangat Fund. The legislation of the Commune Sangat Fund, the legislation of the related planning, programming, and budgeting procedures were also prepared with the assistance of UNCDF experts. And nowadays the Commune Sangat Fund is a centerpiece of the fiscal transfer system in Cambodia, and it has been capitalized with resources that are easily 2 orders of magnitude greater than the original LDF. So the Cambodia case would further strengthen what is already a strong evidence of impact. The second thing in terms of documenting the impact of the LDF is that the LDF, beside impacting the reform of the fiscal transfer system, also leveraged local community resources. A study in Vietnam, in the RIDEF pilot program, which was actually historically the first LDF, the study demonstrated that $1 of RIDEF fund were mobilizing at least $2 of community contribution, not just in kind, but also in cash. Another impact of the LDF was on public spending efficiency. A study of a large set of infrastructure investment in Cambodia, for example, demonstrated that by financing rural infrastructure through an LDF type system, savings in the order of 6% of public resources were realized. With respect to alternative centrally funded and implemented infrastructure mechanisms. The second value is the one I would rather insist more than anything, because I believe that in a sense the LDF might have been a victim of its own success. Yes, it impacted on fiscal transfers mechanisms, but in the process of adoption and mainstreaming, the original intention of the LDF might have blurred, And because the LDF was an oddity in a sense for fiscal decentralization experts. First of all, it violated, the golden rule of no capacity, no responsibilities, no resources, because it was proposing to transfer precisely some resources without previous transfer of responsibility as a mechanism to build capacity, prime the pump, and break the vicious circle. And also because what the LDF was aiming to finance were not responsibilities transferred in the frame of the fiscal decentralization reforms, not specific responsibilities, but rather the general mandate of the local authorities. So it was a mechanism to support their autonomy. This is particularly important because we are at the end of a period in which we have seen so many decentralization reform process which are decentralization without autonomy, without the key ingredient that allows to transform decentralization reforms into development outcome, which are additional and incremental with respect to the simple localization of national policies. So it is particularly important to recover that original meaning of the LDF as a mechanism to support autonomy and create capacity. And this could be something to think about as a new generation of LDF, more explicitly aiming at supporting autonomy and capacity, could be designed. Thank you again for the opportunity to comment on this excellent study.
Thank you, Leonardo. I mean, the beauty of the video is that indeed we cannot cut you. So, but that was really great. Thank you so much. We had some questions, David, in the chat, especially from Paul regarding the role of the LDF in leveraging resources on the ground and not only through the system. But I guess this is something that we won't address right now, but that's a very interesting question. So without further ado, David, the floor is yours for the closing remarks. Thank you, all of you. Thanks.
No, thank you very much indeed, colleagues. And let me try to also address the issues that were raised in the chat box. Yes, Leonardo, it was a great idea to do a video because you get your full 7 minutes in, so we need to learn from that. Thanks, everybody. I'll be very brief in wrapping up. Just the lessons from this longitudinal study and the way forwards. As Priti mentioned in the opening, it's very rare for these kind of longitudinal studies, but all academic research on development success shows that about a decade is the time you need to look at. And that will never find its way into a project report or into an evaluation or into an annual report to the board. And indeed, some of these programs that are being mentioned now, actually, nobody had the patience, if you read the evaluations, to see what was coming. So I think it's very important that we look at these longitudinal studies. Not one size fits all. That's the first lesson. And that remains a core principle of the work we do in the local development finance team, now to be called the local transformative finance team. We've heard about urban, rural, and not one size fits all leads to government-led. We believe local government finance is development finance, and that this longitudinal study shows that. As Paul Kasuli mentioned, and as we heard from Ganga, it is actually one of the features behind the transformation of those two countries. But it's often not characterized as development finance. But if you look in the Addis Ababa Action Declaration, you'll find paragraph 34, which is about local government finance. And we at UNCDF are driving that paragraph forwards. I think the second most important lesson, or the third, I should say, and we got this from all the commentators and very powerfully from Roland White from the World Bank, mechanisms, not projects. The mobilization of wider capital flows. And that is something we take very seriously. One project is good, but we, and even the World Bank, as we heard from Roland, will never be able to solve the world's problems alone. But if you create a mechanism, a financing mechanism, and in particular one which is domestically rooted through domestic banks, domestic fiscal systems, domestic capital markets, then that is development. And that's what other countries' growth paths have shown. So mechanisms, not projects. And the transformative effect, I think we heard that most solidly from the representatives of Nepal and Uganda. Local fiscal space and local fixed capital formation are two of the determinants of economic transformation, and the local development finance and the local development fund is a way to drive that most effectively through these mechanisms that really go to scale. And it's the importance of knowing that they will go to scale that is critical, because the volumes that UNCDF deploys is relatively small, but once it's locked in, the scale comes. And we've seen that with the local climate adaptive living facility. And I think we heard very well about the capacity, the performance, and the effectiveness, the development effectiveness of these resources. We heard that from all the different speakers, and the way it led to even positive but unintended benefits on the wider local economy, both public and private sector, and capacity of local governments, even building the professionalization of the civil service at the local level. So the next steps in our next strategic framework will be to expand this approach to all aspects of subnational transformative finance and to continue the scale-ups. So we've been really learning about the intergovernmental fiscal transfers, and the Local Development Fund was part of pioneering that as a form of development finance. But we've recently started to work a lot more on the asset management angle and on borrowing and bonds, because once this capacity is built, that's when the issue for borrowing and subnational capital markets and local government bonds comes in. And as we've seen with urbanization, which is now very significant across many of the countries we work with, Nepal, Uganda are far more urban now than they were at the times when this was when this work began. The scale of the investment and the type of the investment has changed, and that will only be met by a domestic capital market and domestic bonds, domestic borrowing, special purpose vehicles, and project finance. So we're driving that. The importance of local economic development policy and revenue generating projects through PPPs, the local finance initiative will be taken to scale to be able to pursue that further. And own ways of building own source revenue. I think Paul mentioned that actually that was a key outcome of this work, and that can be developed further. And of course, the public financial management and the public expenditure management cycle are critical, and the procurement and expenditure, because we've heard that this is actually a way of driving private sector growth through private sector procurement of goods and services, because local government finance ends up private sector finance through the procurement of goods and services and infrastructure. And of course, when this is applied to a theme like climate change, you see that this is actually the way to build resilience against to climate change. This is the way to adapt at scale, because all adaptation is inherently local, and that's what we can do with this mechanism. And it has good connectors with the private sector in various elements. This is the way we will take this forwards to develop this knowledge at scale in a wider variety of financial instruments, connecting with the private sector, and to also address very specific issues like climate change through it. But always remembering the point that Leonardo made, that, and going back to the first slide, is not one size fits all. It's local government finance. Therefore, the local autonomy is a key element behind this whole process. And that local autonomy is also part of building sustainable and inclusive societies. So I'm going to stop there. This we could have gone on all day, but thank you so much for joining, those of you that have been able to stay with us for the whole hour. We will circulate the speeches and the presentations, and thank you so much for the team that put this together and all of the comments and presentations. And perhaps if there's demand, we can have a kind of longer coffee discussion on this publication and its implications at a later date, because I really feel that now the discussion is only just beginning, and yet we're out of time. So thank you so much indeed, Christelle, and all the best to all of you.
Thank you. Thank you. There was some questions, so indeed we need a coffee all together to talk about that. Thank you, Jasper, and thank you all the panelists. Thank you. Good to see you all.
Thank you, colleagues. I have to go, unfortunately. Thank you very much. Thank you. All the best.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye, Leonardo. Bye, Paul.
Thank you, Christian.
Bye,
Thank you,
Kaka.
Leonardo.
Also add my
Bye.
thanks. Bye.
Yes, nice to meet. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay.